Right, well, this is going to be a relatively short video because I'm under some time pressure today, but in fact, it's not going to need to be a particularly long video because the big news today is that in all substance there is in fact no news. This was supposed to be the day of the great Russian invasion of Ukraine. Some parts of the Western media even gave the precise hour when this invasion was going to start, which was 3 a.m., presumably Ukraine time. Anyway, that time has come and gone. There's no sign of this invasion. There's no sign of the false flag that some people have been warning about either, by the way. And the Russians, for their part, have spent much of the day hooting their derision. So we've had comments from the rather formidable press spokesman at the Russian Foreign Ministry saying that she would like the Western media to make clear to her exactly which days the invasion is supposed to happen so that she can arrange her vacations around those days. And we've had also Dmitry Peskov, Putin's spokesman, saying that he and Putin exchange a joke with each other, that Peskov should be on hand to ring Putin when the invasion finally takes place. So much mockery and derision from the Russians, which has been happening over the last few hours. In the West, the response, unsurprisingly, has been different. First thing I'm going to say is that it's very interesting to see that all these big news media outlets, Bloomberg, Forbes, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Guardian, the Telegraph, all of these people have not so far come along and said that their report that the war was going to start, the invasion was going to start today, Wednesday, 16th February, was actually wrong. They haven't actually gone back and retracted their previous comments. They just don't refer to them. It's like those comments have vanished into a memory hole, and I suspect that's where they're going to remain. But perhaps an even more interesting response is the fact that Western governments don't seem to be at all happy that this great invasion isn't happening. When I say Western governments, I should perhaps make it clear that what I am referring to is the British and American governments and, of course, the NATO headquarters. So we've had comments from Joe Biden, President Biden, who still talks about the invasion still being likely or possible or capable of happening at any time. We see the Americans saying that they see no signs of any de-escalation, despite the fact, as I said, that the invasion hasn't happened. And the previous announcement made yesterday that the Russians are winding up their exercises on schedule, by the way, in Belarus and Crimea. And we've had comments from NATO headquarters, from Jens Stoltenberg himself, that more Russian formations are heading towards the Ukrainian border. So, in fact, so far from the de-escalation happening, the build-up is still continuing. And, by the way, the British government has been saying the same thing. And British Defence Secretary has doubled down on his whiff of Munich comment about the diplomatic action that some European countries are engaging in, despite the fact that when this was previously made, there was a protest about it from no less a country than Ukraine itself. And in fact, we've had comments about this very strange reaction from the Western governments. You'd have thought that the Western governments would be delighted and happy that this war that they've been warning about hasn't happened. Well, we've had a comment about it again from Maria Zakharova, though she's careful not so much to talk about Western governments as the Western media. She says, to the regret of many Western media, once again the war failed to begin. They'd gone to great lengths trying to make it a reality, Possibly their pages were scenes of ferocious battles, but all this has nothing to do with reality. In the previous days, no war happened, but they don't get upset and keep waiting for it. With a tenacity worthy of a better cause. For the first time ever in the history of humanity, not only a suspect aggressor country, whose role was assigned to Russia, but also a potential victim country, whose role was assigned to Ukraine, both denied all plans stubbornly dictated for them by the Anglo-Saxon mass media. And she went on to say that though Russia and Ukraine adhered to fundamentally different views on many issues, they both symmetrically stated that there were no facts indicating preparations for an invasion or a war of any kind. So that's all I'm going to say about this. It's clear that there's not going to be a war today. There's not been any great false flag for the moment. As I've said, the possibility of false flags remains very real, and the possibility of some kind of foolish action by someone in eastern Ukraine can never be discounted. But if we are looking at this from a Ukrainian point of view, I don't really understand the logic of triggering a war in eastern Ukraine when the only consequence is the destruction of Ukraine itself, and for no better reason than that the West should be able to impose sanctions, which even many in the West are now admitting are going to be ineffectual. And by the way, on that topic, we've now had a comment from Klaus Knot, who happens to be the chairman of the Dutch Central Bank and the chair of the Financial Stability Board, which the Financial Times says is the world's most powerful financial watchdog. And he has called on Western leaders to think twice before imposing sanctions on Russia, warning that the most punishing penalties run the risk of undermining global stability. And the Financial Times talks about how Mr. Knot has specifically warned against suspending Russia's access to the SWIFT international payment system. And he says, when applying severe measures, one should always think twice and always be aware of consequences. And he then went on to say, or was reported by the Financial Times as warning that cutting off Russia's access to SWIFT, though under discussion, would be a mistake, because it might have some financial ramifications, and I would urge policymakers to take that into account, that removing Russia's access to SWIFT would create severe operational problems for banks which are cut off from the network. He means Russian banks, but it would not in itself prevent them from dealing with other lenders around the world. But such a move might spur Russia to step up efforts to develop alternative systems. It has already formed an alternative messaging system called SPFS, although this is less capable than the SWIFT network. Well, as to that last point about how capable or not SPFS actually is, we don't really know. If we're talking about transactions within Russia, I suspect at least equally capable as SWIFT itself. If we're talking about its ability to engage in international financial transactions, that of course is more limited, but that I suspect is going to change very soon, especially if China and Russia link up their messaging systems with each other, and if other countries like Iran and conceivably even Japan and possibly India start to join them too. And that is what people like Mr. Klaus Knot are obviously concerned about. By the way, that article in the Financial Times, which is in behind a paywall. Perhaps the most extraordinary part of it is the comments thread, in which the outrage from those who want some kind of scorched earth policy against Russia is a wonder to behold. The talk of Munich, Chamberlain, appeasement, all those sort of things is all written out there in abundance. And it gives one a depressing idea of the fanaticism of some people in this sort of situation. Anyway, so much for the fact that there's not been a war, but that the war scare is apparently going to go on and on, with more reports of more Russian troops heading for the border. Perhaps the one thing of substance which did take place, not today, Wednesday, but yesterday, Tuesday, 15th February, was the meeting in Moscow of the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz and the Russian President Vladimir Putin. And I'm going to make a general observation. I've been reading all the various comments that Scholz made whilst he was in Moscow. And I have to say that two things immediately struck me. First of all, his meeting with Putin lasted 4 hours, which is significantly less than the 6-hour meeting that Putin and Macron had with each other last week. And the press conference with Putin and Scholz was a great deal less interesting and less informative than the press conference involving Putin and Macron. I have to say that the overall impression I get of Scholz, reading all his various comments, the comments he made in Washington, the comments he subsequently made in Kiev, where he's just been and met with Zelensky, I'll discuss that more in a moment, and again, these comments that he made when in Moscow, is that the impression I get overall is of a rather clunky person, somebody who lacks the mental agility and skill of others. Obviously, he's not in the same league as Putin and Xi Jinping. Frankly, he's not really on the same level as Macron either, or even his own serpentine predecessor, Angela Merkel. I have to say that he comes across as clunky and worthy, and perhaps, dare I even say it, a little dim. Anyway, that might be unfair. He could be very inexperienced, and of course he's severely boxed in what he has to say. So, of course, he had to tick all the boxes. He had to talk about Navalny, though he did so without much conviction. He brought up the topic of Memorial. This is a Russian NGO which the Russians have closed down because, as far as they're concerned, it's transformed from being a historical an NGO concerned with historical matters into a political entity funded by from abroad, and therefore suspect and liable under Russia's equivalent to FARA, the Foreign Agents Registration Act, which it has refused to register itself under. The Russians also, I think, feel that some of its actions are bordered on extremism. Well, I'm not going to discuss Memorial in this video, but suffice to say that Scholz brought it up. And he tried to defend NATO's war against Yugoslavia, which is, I think, an extremely ill-adroit thing to do while in Moscow, and it provoked a rather acid comment from Putin. Scholz said that there was a genocide going on in Yugoslavia, and that the war that was fought in Yugoslavia was intended to prevent a genocide. And Putin stepped in and said, well, Russia considers that there's a genocide taking place in the Donbass. So there we are. So I think that was a very ill-advised thing to say in Moscow to a Russian audience, given how strongly Russians, not just elite Russians, but Russians generally feel about that war in 1999, that Yugoslav war in 1999. Anyway, the most interesting comment by far came at the end, in which he talked about the Minsk agreement and about the issue of Ukraine's admission into NATO. And he said the following. This is Scholz. It is necessary to prevent the emergence of a dangerous situation, which all of us would like to avoid. Everyone ought to know that there are major shifts and points of reference for further talks. The first thing to do is to solve the Ukrainian problem with a focus on the Minsk agreements. The Minsk process is afoot and everyone should abide by it. All of us must have the will to talk to each other. This also concerns the differing positions on NATO expansion. Now, this is not entirely clear, but the comment, everyone should abide by it, I have to say, does look like a reference to Ukraine. And at another point in his comments, Scholz said that the Ukrainians, in place of this law on local government in Donbass that they had proposed, and which they put before the Rada, and which Macron persuaded them to drop, that they're now proposing to put forward a package of further laws, but that before those laws are presented to the Rada, they would be shown to the contact group, the tripartite contact group, presumably for discussion there. And it's important to say that the contact group is a grouping that is intended to mediate the strengthening of the ceasefire in Donbass, and the representatives, the leaders of the two Donbass republics, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, participate in the work of this contact group. So it looks like some kind of a roundabout way of getting some kind of negotiations between the Ukrainians and the leaders of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics underway. And as I said, the comment about that everyone should abide by the Minsk agreement does seem in some way to refer to Ukraine. And then Scholz went on to say, and this is where he talked about NATO, on the differing positions on NATO expansion, the situation is somewhat odd. No expansion is being planned, nor is it discussed or put on the agenda. Everyone knows about it. Whilst each of us is in office, we will not have to deal with this. I do not know how much longer Mr. President, he means Putin, will remain in his post. I think this might be a long time, but not an eternity. I mean, we will not be addressing this. Our task, therefore, is to reach political mutual understanding and a situation where no one renounces their principles. This is political leadership and the responsibility that we bear to ensure peace and international cooperation in Europe. This is always discussed when we talk about matters such as security, cooperation in Europe, transparency and arms control. The desiderata are formulated. NATO has responded positively, differently from what the other side desired, but this should be used as a basis for making further headway. And there's been further reports that on the plane flying back from Moscow to Berlin, Scholz apparently told the German media that there was absolutely no sense having a war in Europe over Ukraine's membership of NATO, given that that membership isn't going to happen. Now, I have to say, Scholz's words here are extremely convoluted. And on the specific point that no expansion is being planned, nor is it discussed or put on the agenda. Everybody knows about it. Well, that is straightforwardly wrong. It's been talked about all the time. The Russians talk about it. The Ukrainians talk about it. The Ukrainians over the last year have repeatedly been calling for a NATO membership action plan. So when Scholz says that no one is talking about it, well, he is simply wrong about this. And of course, when he's telling Putin that, this isn't going to happen anytime soon, and it's not going to happen anytime that Putin himself is president, he's not saying that this will never happen, and he seems to be trying to kick the can on this hot topic down the road. And Putin, by the way, would have absolutely nothing of this. These were the comments that Putin made in response to these rather ambiguous words of Scholz. As for the expansion of NATO, you said remarkable words. NATO representatives have said that Ukraine's accession is simply unrealistic in the next few years. What does it mean, they have said? We need to understand what they have said means in relations between states. For 30 years, we have been told that there will be no NATO expansion whatsoever, not by an inch towards the Russian border. And now we see NATO infrastructure right outside our home. Moreover, there is a discussion of Ukraine's accession to NATO. As you said, they say it will not happen tomorrow. But when will it happen? The day after tomorrow? What does it change for us in the historical perspective? Nothing at all. We hear that Ukraine is not ready to join NATO today. We are aware of this statement. Then they say immediately that NATO will not accept it tomorrow. Will they accept Ukraine once they have prepared it for accession? It may be too late for us then. So we want to address this issue now, right now, immediately, through negotiations and by peaceful means. This is our understanding of the process, and we really hope that our partners will hear our concerns and take them seriously. So, as you see, Putin is having absolutely nothing of this. Scholz is coming along telling Putin, well, there's not going to be NATO membership of Ukrainian membership of NATO anytime soon. It's not on anyone's agenda. What are you worried about? And Putin comes back and says, thank you very much. We know all that. We've heard all that. We've heard the same thing said to us before. We're not prepared to accept it this time. We've been given all kinds of promises which weren't kept. This time we insist on a binding commitment, and we want it now. So it's interesting to see the dynamic, and I have to say that it does seem to me that Scholz here is a little bit on the back foot, because of course if he says that NATO membership for Ukraine is not on the agenda, which is what he said, then why doesn't he straightforwardly agree to this and say so in a written document, a treaty, an agreement, call it whatever you will, with the Russians, which, as Putin also pointed out over the course of this press conference, would not in fact contradict the provisions of Article 10 of the Washington Treaty in any respect. Well, the overall impression I get from Scholz's visit is that the Germans are keen to keep diplomatic action going. They are extremely worried and very frightened about the possibility of a war. They clearly want to cling on to Nord Stream 2. This is also something that came across very clearly from this press conference. Scholz, by the way, did mention Nord Stream 2 by name over the course of this press conference, but they are not yet able publicly to break with the Americans on this issue, because of course they are afraid of what the American reaction might be. Anyway, all of this has been picked up in London, and it seems to have been what again provoked Ben Wallace to come up with his whiff of Munich comments. I would add that of course, Scholz, before meeting with Putin, also met with Zelensky. Many people have commented on how shaken and exhausted Zelensky looked over the course of the press conference that followed. Again, very little light was cast on what was said, but again, I got the strong impression that the Germans are now pushing the Ukrainians, doing what they should have been doing over the last 8 years. They've been pushing the Ukrainians to move forward with Minsk, to start working towards granting that autonomy to the Donbass, agreeing the terms of that constitution, do all those things which they should have done over the last 8 years. And of course, the Ukrainians are very, very unhappy about that indeed, but that there is very little that they can do. And of course, in addition to that, and at the same time, Scholz will surely have told Zelensky the same thing that he told Putin, which is that so far as Germany is concerned, Ukraine's membership of NATO is simply not on the agenda. So that probably explains why Zelensky was looking upset and stressed and tired. Though I have to say that Zelensky has much cause to be upset and stressed and tired over the last few days, because of course, even as the Russians have been confirming that their exercises in Belarus and in Crimea are winding down, the great retreat from Kiev, the escape from Kiev, if you like, continues. More and more people are scuttling away. It's now clear that the entire US embassy in Kiev is being closed down. It seems all the computers in the embassy have been destroyed. All the printing is happening. And of course, we're getting reports that all sorts of oligarchs, business people are now busy flying out of Ukraine as fast as they can. There was even a list on a pro-Russian website. I'm not going to repeat the list of which particular oligarchs have left. The three most important, Rinat Akhmetov, Pinchuk and Kolomoisky, were not, as it happens, on that particular list, but I understand that Akhmetov and Pinchuk have indeed left, and Kolomoisky, I believe, is in Switzerland. So they are not in Kiev either at this time. And perhaps even sadder, it seems that the Ukrainian parliament, which was supposed to meet on Tuesday, was unable to meet because more than half of the MPs, the delegates, the deputies have fled, or at least were not available, so that the parliament wasn't able to obtain a quorum. So it's quite a sad story, and of course it's been reinforced with reports which I've seen in various places, which I'm not able to confirm or discuss in any meaningful way, about mysterious black painted stealthy helicopters flying into Western Ukraine and evacuating people who turn up in black SUVs. Things that, as I said, no doubt are going on all over the place, right across Ukraine, but I can't really decipher or understand because I just don't have the information to comment upon them. I'm going to finish with one further point. If the Western powers want to destroy Ukraine, they really want to hollow it out, and they're going about it in entirely the right way. Now, in previous program which I did, I speculated that one of the major reasons for this war scare was to try to prevent Olaf Scholz from going to Moscow, and as part of a long-term plan to get the Germans to drop Nord Stream 2 as part of a sanctions package. Now, I remain strongly of that view, and in view of that, perhaps the single most important fact about Scholz's visit to Moscow is that it took place at all. But as has been commented upon by others, um, there are possibly multiple agendas being followed by different people. So there's been comments made about the fact that there's a festering political crisis in Washington, that a recent court filing by special counsel John Durham appears to implicate a senior member of the Biden administration, the person who is most heavily implicated in conjuring up this war scare, and that suggests that he might have a personal reason for creating a war scare which keeps Durham at bay. That's entirely possible. But I have to say something else. I don't think that this is the case openly. I don't think anybody in Washington is discussing this possibility. But it does increasingly look as if the United States and Britain are preparing to write Ukraine off. They're pulling out all their people. They're closing down their embassies in Kiev. British ambassador bravely remains there, but apparently she works with a tiny staff, and one wonders how long she will be in Kiev. All the military people, the advisors, the personnel, they've all been pulled out. There's calls to all the citizens of all of these various countries to pull out as well. Kiev is emptying, and of course the business people have left, the oligarchs have left, many of the MPs have left. This goes on for very much longer. If this pressure continues, one wonders what might happen. I mean, might the ministries start to relocate to Lvov as well? Might we see a pullout of the government from Kiev? Might it relocate to Lvov? It's very interesting to notice that Zelensky went out of his way to say that he and his family was staying in Kiev, which gives a strong impression that there's some pressure on him to leave Kiev and to go to Lvov. Well, he's resisting that. I do wonder whether somebody hasn't, at some level, made a decision that the Ukrainian government should relocate to Lvov as well, on the Polish border, with a sort of holdout area in western Ukraine, and the rest of Ukraine being abandoned. And that might fit in with a kind of pattern which we've seen in previous places, especially since the current administration took office. After all, in Afghanistan, they pulled out suddenly, as we've said in our videos, particularly on our Duran videos, like thieves in the night, abandoning the Afghan government to its fate. Eventually, the president of Afghanistan, Mr. Ghani, Ashraf Ghani, fled. Most of the ministers fled as well, and the government eventually collapsed, and the whole country eventually fell to the Taliban. And then the United States went ahead and imposed sanctions on the country, apparently looking to make it some kind of a desert. And I do wonder sometimes whether perhaps, without this perhaps being discussed or spoken about, something like a similar agenda isn't now being followed with Ukraine. Abandon all the areas of central Ukraine, the Donbass, the central regions like Kiev, the great port city of Odessa, Nikolaev, Kherson, all of these places. They're clearly undefendable. They've been pillaged of all that they reasonably have. Abandon them to their fate. Let the Russians move in, and then impose sanctions. In other words, repeat the same pattern as the pattern we saw with Afghanistan, and then try and preserve some kind of a rump state in western Ukraine, in Galicia, agitate to ensure that this particular rump state in Lvov retains Ukraine's seat in the United Nations and talk up the story of Russian aggression against Ukraine, an aggression which wouldn't really have happened because in that situation the Russians would simply move in or would be compelled to move in to fill a vacuum that had been created. Well, I want to stress again, I'm not saying that I have any knowledge of this. This is just speculative. And it's possible, I think it's most unlikely, by the way, that this has been openly talked about in Washington. I'm sure that nobody in Washington is openly speaking about this. But if you look at what is happening on the ground, it is increasingly looking as if something like that is being prepared and underway. If so, then I have to say straight away that all this talk, all these negotiations that Macron and Scholz may be engaging in with Putin, all of these are a complete exercise in futility, a complete waste of time, because long before they are ever concluded, there will be no Ukraine left to save. Well, thank you very much for joining me today for this program. I look forward to you joining me again in future programs, both on this channel and on our main channel, the Duran. And also, please remember to check out Alex Christoforou, my colleague and friend's channel as well. And remember that you can find us on Rumble, as I said. And of course, if you go to Rumble, you can go straight to our locals page. And we are now active and busy on our locals page. We publish a lot of exclusive content there. We have an active community there, a thriving community, which you can join. You can publish your own exclusive content